Okay, so a major theme in alchemy that comes to permeate Western esotericism slash hermeticism slash magic is the notion of the great work. What is the great work? Sounds kind of ominous, doesn't it? Well, the great work ultimately is pretty much equivalent to what in Eastern traditions would be called enlightenment. Specifically, I think it has a lot in common with the Tibetan notion of Mahamudra, or Dzogchen, the great perfection, the realization of the ultimate connection and perfection of everything as it's unfolding in every moment. Obviously, that's a pretty high state of realization. Most of us are not deeply in connection with the ultimate perfection of everything. At least me, I feel like I get angry and sad all the time. So there's, it takes a lot of work to get to that place. That's why it's called the great work and not the big easy. Nonetheless, that's not to say that emotions and things like that don't play a role in the life of somebody who's attained the great work or who's fully enlightened. It's just that they're maybe qualitatively a bit different than the way that most of us reactively experience our little ego offenses and whatnot. So, the great work. The notion is that what we're doing is we are combining or joining our little small self, our little ego, to the big self with a capital S, the divine self. And so in Hindu terms, that's sort of like the union of Atman, the individual self, with Brahman, the divine self. We could also say that it's like the union with the Christ within, or the Hermes within, or the Odin within, or, whatever you want to call divinity. It is that union. So the great work, again, as stated in the title, is a big ongoing process. It's not something that one can do in a weekend and, call it finished. But I do think that the innovations in psychology that Carl Jung made, some of the innovations in magic that Aleister Crowley made in the 20th century have opened up avenues potentially for the great work to be completed more readily, more quickly by us busy modern people. And that's something that I'm happy to talk more about, and I'm sure that we will. But just to give you a basic idea, there's some synonyms for the great work that are important, and you'll probably hear me use them again and again. One of them is the alchemical marriage, so the marriage of the smaller self and the larger self. Which can also be understood as the marriage between the conscious, because the smaller self, the ego, is conscious, and the unconscious, because usually our divinity is unconscious. We're not totally aware of it all the time, right? So the union between the smaller self and larger self, the conscious and the unconscious, the alchemical marriage. This is also known as attaining knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. So that term comes from I believe it was a 15th century grimoire by Abramelin the Mage about this months-long, very ascetic working invocation of an entity called the holy guardian angel, with the notion being that a magician, before being able to command lower spirits, demons or daemons who are capable of building and changing things in the material world, that a magician first has to really purify themselves, elevate themselves, connect with their larger nature, their higher nature, and then start working with the lower. So this notion is also present in Solomonic magic, because great King Solomon got himself lots of celestial divine bona fides before he started summoning and binding the demons who built the temple for him. So Solomonic magic, the grimoire of Abramelin the Mage, major influences on 20th century magicians like Aleister Crowley. Crowley, of course, was very concerned with attaining knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. He liked to use that terminology for it, even though he, let me say this, of course, Crowley was not pious by any conventional standards, and he kind of thought the term Holy Guardian Angel was funny, because it's a little bit over-the-top sentimental, and it sort of conjures these Catholic school, Sunday school visions of a giant, benevolent creature with wings and a halo who's sweeping down to rescue little children from falling off the edge of a precipice or something. But that's not actually what the Holy Guardian Angel refers to. The Holy Guardian Angel more... well, I mean, it is what it refers... okay, let me slow this down a second. What the term Holy Guardian Angel refers to, again, is this larger self. So the self, with a capital S, includes all dualities and unites them. So it's both the conventional good Christian God or, benevolent creator that we see reflected in a lot of religions, and it's the devil or the trickster or the evil one or whatever, simultaneously. It's both. So Jung was rather influenced by Gnostic texts. And in Gnostic texts, which have a lot of overlap and interweaving with Hermetic texts, again, usually stemming out of Alexandria around the early centuries after the death of Christ, death of Christ. Anyways, Abraxas was a Gnostic deity that Jung felt was a great representation of the self. And the notion with Abraxas is that he is represented by the full circumference of a circle, or the 365 days of a solar year. So with Abraxas, there's this notion of totality and circular roundness that embraces everything. So another way of understanding this larger self, or the Holy Guardian Angel, is that it is all of existence minus the little ego self that we usually think that we are. That's a fun definition. Another way of understanding it is that it is the self that we will eventually evolve into. So you could say your future magical self, your future most evolved magical self, which is, time is actually non-linear. That's a whole other discussion. But it's actually, so because time is non-linear, your future magical self, your wholly evolved version of you is influencing you right now in this moment, and you can tap into that field of influence. Another way of understanding the Holy Guardian Angel / self with capital S is that, the Greeks called it the agathos daemon, or the good spirit. So Socrates, the philosopher, had a daemon who warned him not to do certain things. And this was a common notion throughout the classical world. It was that, some people had good spirits that helped them. Another idea in the Norse world is the notion of a fylgja, or a fetch, and I may be totally botching that pronunciation, but this is the notion of, usually it's a spirit that appears to you right before you die, and then it leads you onward into the next world. And the ancient Norse had an idea that certain people, sorcerers, witches, magicians, namely, were capable of contacting and dialoguing with their fetch or their fylgja while still alive. And another name for the fetch or the fylgja in the Norse tradition is fate. And that's very, very interesting. So this notion that, this larger self, this higher self, is also your fate, and that if you're a magician, you are capable of contacting and dialoguing with this fate and potentially changing what it has in store for you, or changing what it has in store for the people around you, or, your tribe or nation, whatnot. So I find that idea particularly interesting in reference to this notion that Carl Jung had, this quote that I like to bring up all the time because I just find it so amazing. Carl Jung said, "Unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate." In other words, we all have these secret patterns, desires, fears that are running us at an unconscious level. And most people never make those conscious at all. They never become aware of the extent to which they really don't have free will because they're just being run by these kind of robotic, inherited programs that come from family, that come from society, that come from generational trauma, personal trauma, what have you. And they're just run by them. And they're not really, they don't really have as much free agency as they think that they do. Or I should say, I don't have as much free agency as I like to think that I do. In fact, the work of becoming an actual free agent, of having some semblance of what we could call autonomy, again, it's a lot of work. That is the great work, is realizing and coming into contact with and confronting with a lot of these very uncomfortable, very taboo, very sensational and intense elements within us, and, freeing them, making them conscious, liberating the energy that's been stuck in those patterns, stuck in those loops, freeing that energy so that we can use it to create new things in our lives. New things in our lives, rather. That, I would say, is the essence of magic, and that is the essence of this formula that's really important in all alchemy and in the alchemy of the psyche, and that formula is solve et coagula. So solve just means to dissolve, and coagula means, of course, to coagulate, to bring together, usually bringing together in some kind of new, higher organization that's more potent, more healing, more beautiful than what existed previously. And we can have a whole big discussion soon about solve et coagula, but I'll just put that out there, that's what we're talking about here. When we are making the unconscious conscious, that's always an operation that entails solve et coagula. So, and that's an operation that entails achieving what the Norse noticed that their best sorcerers, magicians, witches could do, which is coming into dialogue with your fate, coming into knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel, coming into this deep, marriage with your higher self. And, the marriage starts with a fun wedding, and then it's a lot of conversation and a lot of uncomfortable work and a lot of, fun times too, great times, but also, marriage, any marriage, including your marriage to your larger magical self, takes effort. Nobody ever said it was super easy. Okay, so I think this is starting to give us an idea of what the great work is and why it's desirable, why we would want to accomplish it. We want to accomplish it so that our lives are not limited by all of this inherited nonsense that we've got from our families, from culture, these very limiting patterns. Think about it. Think about how many people in your life do you know who have made a vast, vast improvement in their life circumstances, who have gone from, really downtrodden or just mediocre to fabulous. I bet not that many. I bet maybe one or maybe two. And then I bet a whole bunch of other people who are just kind of treading water. They're just sort of, they're running in the same career patterns, relationship patterns, health patterns that they've always had. And the sad thing is those patterns, these robotic, conditioned, inherited patterns tend to get worse as people get older. So, sometimes people get wiser and happier as they get older. And a lot of times they get more stuck in their ways and more miserable, especially, again, in our modern culture, which has a real dearth of wisdom teaching in it. So this is what we are facing. If we want to make a really big change in our lives, if we want to really up-level the amount of income that we have, if we want to really up-level the level of influence and leadership that we have in the world, if we want to really, really expand and deepen our connection with our partner in our romance, our connection with our children, our connection with our friends and community, we need to learn how to make the unconscious conscious so that we're no longer stuck in these ruts, unwittingly running these programs and creating the same results for ourselves over and over again. So the great work frees us from that, and that's why it's worth doing, even though it takes, oh my gosh, a lot of effort every day, and even though it's uncomfortable at times, that's why it's worth it. It can also be, the great work can also be stunning, astounding. It can bring a level of surprise and wonderment and joy and revelation into your life that, nothing else really can. So, which is to say that the process, while not easy, is rewarding as we go along the way, even before we reach the big enchilada of ultimate enlightenment, like the level to which people like Jesus Christ and Gautama Buddha, and I'm sure a whole lot of women and people of other genders that we haven't heard about through history thanks to patriarchal bias. Even if we don't reach that level in this lifetime, we can still get really far, and we can still, make our experience of life so much more enjoyable than it would be if we never did any of this work. So, one of the reasons why I like Western esotericism / hermeticism / magic, alchemy, is that the first goal, there's sort of like two goals in it. So instead of just the goal of ultimate supreme enlightenment, which usually gets emphasized a lot in Eastern traditions, there's a sort of a medium goal along the way, which I think is really realizable. And that is the goal of what we could call the alchemical wedding, or knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. So that's like this intermediate level where you learn how to contact this larger part of yourself. You learn how to be in dialogue with it, in relationship with it. It guides you. It's the inner teacher. It gives you intuitions. It gives you inspiration, and it leads you forward on your journey to ultimate enlightenment and to fulfilling your earthly purpose for incarnation. So this level, if you're familiar with the Kabbalah at all, and probably right now I won't be able to delve into a huge discussion of the Kabbalah, but it corresponds to Tifereth on the Tree of Life, which is the level of consciousness associated with the sun, associated with the heart. Tifereth means beauty, and so this is what this series is all about, and this is what the work that I do in my business, the teaching work, is all about, is getting us to this heart-centered, solar level of beauty, this level of consciousness that entails a perception of a deep symmetry, a deep balance, a deep degree of wonder, majesty, and inspiration. So that's what's going on. And I hope that this little description of the great work has energized you and given you some thoughts about what might be possible in future episodes, I'm going to be talking a whole lot more about how do we do this, what goes into the process of achieving knowledge and conversation, of achieving this Tifereth, beauty, heart-centered level of consciousness where we get inspiration and guidance. And yeah, stay tuned for more. Bye-bye.